Hello everyone, my name is Vlad and I'm from Russia, and on my channel I talk about Russia. And today I wanna tell you about the main Russian propagandist, or the main clown in Russia. A man who motivates Russians to go and fight in Ukraine, who fosters hatred towards Ukrainians, Europeans, Americans, liberals, gays and so on. He also praises for Russian president and calls for unity around him as the main leader fighting for Russia's freedom against the whole world that wants to seize and destroy it. In his name, Vladimir Solovyov. I wanna tell you what he says in his broadcast about his career rise and how radically his opinion has changed. But now, write in the comment who is the main propagandist is in your country, and if there is such a freak on your television.
Vladimir Solovyov is a star of the Central Channel on Russian television, a radio host, the author of documentaries about Putin, and the recipient of several state awards, including a medal for the liberation of Crimea and Sevastopol. He earns millions in Russia, showing his hatred towards Europe, America, and gays. He also owns two villas in Italy on the island of Como, which cost millions of euros. Like a typical Russian patriot, he had a residence permit in Italy. Moreover, his son is a model in London. And all this does not prevent him. For many years, he had been pouring dirt on the West on Central television, calling for the destruction of Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. And when there were protests against the current government in Moscow, he called these people these 2% of crap who think they have the right to explain something to anyone on his show. In general, insulting people, calling them scum, Nazis, etc. live on the radio is normal for him. Also, the complaints of the residents of Russia living in Belgorod, where rockets and drones regularly fly in the residential buildings now, he calls disgusting hysteria. In response to this, the residents of Belgorod launch a hate campaign against Solovyov and asks to ban his shows in their region. His programs are broadcasted for 3-4 hours on various Russian platforms. On March 8, 2022, Solovyov's YouTube account and channel were deleted for violating the rules. Once during his show, the comment section was opened, and immediately insults towards Solovyov poured in, so he called his moderators idiots and threatened them with execution.
And it would be fair if there was another propagandist on some other channel, pushing absolutely the opposite position, but in Russia there is no such thing. Only one position where Putin is good and everyone who is against him is bad. Millions of Russians watching and listen to him and sincerely believe what he says, although most likely the majority of his subscribers and views are not real, but his shows are full of negativity and anger towards everything.
But the main feature of his programs is his behavior, where he shouts, insults everyone, threatens, shows combat techniques, and even dances. For being hysterical, shamelessly lying, being rude, and insulting people on Central television, he is paid millions. He's always ready to prepare Russians for some reforms, saying that raising the retirement age is a necessity, or to shift the focus from internal problems to an external enemy, saying that Americans want to destroy Russia with nuclear weapons, and we need to rally around our president, as well as to support the Russian authorities in any situation. Today, he is one of the main faces of Russian propaganda, but it was not always like this. Like a typical propagandist who will cater to any authority, he is a master of changing his opinion. In Russia, not everyone remembers now, but once Solovyov held quite liberal views, spoke in defense of freedom of speech, and in general turned out to be a decent person. Back in 2011, he was vehemently against any discussions about the annexation of Crimea, but since 2014, he publicly celebrated the annexation of Crimea and insulted anyone who did not share his point of view. The same applies to the war in Ukraine. Once he said, there will never be a war between Russia and Ukraine, because any person who seriously attempts such an action is a criminal. In Ukraine, they are absolutely brotherly people to us in spirit, blood, and history, and a war with them is the worst crime one can imagine. But today he calls for the destruction of Ukraine in Europe with a nuclear strike, and he calls Russians who don't want to go to war in Ukraine cowards and scoundrels. So what happened to him, and how did this revolution occur? and what was its cause. Let's try to figure it out.
Box, 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 box.
Solovyov began his career in 1996, when he accidentally became a replacement of the Civil Rain radio station. His wit and ability to speak Russian in English amazed the management, and soon he became a regular host of another show. Solovyov builds his image as a hedonist, someone who enjoys life and seeks to derive maximum pleasure from various aspects of it. In his programs and interviews, he regularly demonstrates his success, luxury, and influence. Such an image helps Solovyov strengthen his position on television, attract attention to his programs, and create an impression of a successful, attractive person. In the early 2000s, Solovyov continued his career on several television channels, attracting the audience's attention with discussion of current issues. But in 2001, the NTV channel collapsed. Let me briefly tell you the backstory. Once upon a time, NTV was the best Russian television channel, a stellar lineup of hosts, journalists, the coolest shows that Russians still remember. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin became president, and NTV also did not give in to him. They sharply criticized him on the air, and even mocked him. At that time, Vladimir Solovyov allowed himself to sharply criticize the wars in Chechnya, as well as Putin and his government, and the deprivation of freedom in Russia. In addition to journalism, Solovyov was involved in public activities. In 2002, at the invitation of Yela Pamfilova, who was the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights, Solovyov became a member of this commission. Back in 2005, Solovyov suddenly took part in the establishment of the Nasha movement, expressing support for President Putin's policy. This sharp change in his views sparked considerable debate and criticism. In response to accusations that Solovyov is a mercenary and will say anything for money, he often replies that he is a wealthy individual who earned everything through business in 1990s Russia. Referring to business dealings in the 90s is common, as it's difficult to verify the authenticity of such claims. However, it's known that in 2004, Vladimir Solovyov requested improved housing conditions, obtaining a large apartment in central Moscow from the city government. A successful businessman on paper, he appears as a needy, father of many children, supposedly entitled to state-provided housing. Solovyov's biography also includes a period when he was taken off television screens. However, this period was brief. In early 2009, it was announced that the program To the Barrier was being closed down after running for 6 years. It was a sort of verbal duel between politicians from opposing camps. The program was criticized for featuring the same people all the time, but it was successful with viewers. The official reason for its closure was explained as obscure corporate reasons. It was also suggested that there were numerous complaints against Solovyov regarding both the guests he invited and what they said. There were many versions of the event. Solovyov himself claimed that people from the presidential administration removed him from the screen because of his comments on unsavory actions. However, already in 2010, Solovyov was invited to another main central television channel, where he has been working successfully ever since. Thus, he works on radio daily and almost daily on television. During short breaks, he travels around the country conducting master classes on hard-nosed negotiation strategy. The entry fee for this ranges from $200 to $1,000. Despite giving advice, he himself does not follow it, and on his shows he often insults those who disagree with him and asks for them to be thrown out of the studio. If you track Solovyov's statements on the same topic over several years, you can see a remarkable change in his person's opinions. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in the early 2000s, Solovyov strongly criticized Vladimir Putin, Gazprom, and the curtailment of freedom of speech, stating that journalists are always independent individuals, but over the years he became Putin's chief propagandist and received awards from him. Another story of flip-flopping, but far more absurd. During one of his appearances in 2013, Solovyov was asked, "Is the return of Crimea possible?" To which Vladimir immediately responded, "God forbid, why? Why do you need Crimea?" He said that Crimea legitimately belonged to Ukraine, and that its return was not worth the lives of Ukrainian and Russian people. But a year later, the Russian authorities decided to annex Crimea. Yet they did not inform Solovyov about it, so he gracefully and instantly changed his opinion, and with the same confidence declared, "We have been moving towards this day as much as we could. Crimea and Sevastopol are once again part of Russia." But perhaps the main reason he is so hated is Ukraine, or more precisely what he says about it every day for many years. According to Solovyov, any internal problems within Russia are the result of Ukrainian actions, and that Ukraine is nothing but evil, a breeding ground for Nazis, fascists, and scoundrels. Also, Vladimir Solovyov wants to be feared, so he regularly mentions martial arts, and in one of his broadcasts, he stood up and began demonstrating the rather peculiar moves and strikes, and these videos have become memes and jokes. Threats of physical harm from Solovyov are commonplace. For example, when he just started his YouTube channel, he got into a verbal spat with very famous Russian commentator and TV presenter, Vasily Utkin. Interestingly, the surnames Solovyov and Utkin derive from the words naming birds, nightingale and duck. So here what's happened. Vasily Utkin critically commented on the situation in the country, or rather on the lack of financial payments to citizens due to self-isolation and loss of employment. For those unaware, during the COVID pandemic, Vladimir Putin did not declare a quarantine and did not allocate payments, but simply told citizens to stay at home and not to go to work while keeping their salaries. But employers decided not to pay salaries to employees who did not go to work. Plus, for going outside without specific permits, the state began imposing fines, and so on. That's how it is in Russia. So, in response to these accusations, Vladimir Solovyov began to insult and offend Vasily Utkin. Poor Utkin, Tourette's syndrome is evident, and burdened with severe depression. Professional help is needed. He cannot cope on his own. I can pay for his treatment. And on the internet, a real battle unfolded between two very popular TV presenters, which the whole country was watching. I will try to translate how they insulted each other. Then Vasily Utkin challenged him to battle to humiliate him, but Vladimir Solovyov constantly refused, instead threatening physical violence. How did Solovyov turn into a propagandist and why did it happen? It could be said that it was pushed by the authoritarian system that has developed in our country, where dissent is suppressed, and the idea of the right point of view is encouraged, where there is not just censorship, but self-censorship as well. There is some truth to this. Indeed, for people like Solovyov, favorable conditions are created, and they gain a lot of resources, popularity, and of course, money. Of course, it's not just about the system, but also about the person, as history shows. There are people who feel great under any regime. Many younger or less fortunate journalists are forced to choose between good earnings and consciousness, and surely not all of them find this choice as easy as it's for Vladimir Solovyov. For over 20 years, Solovyov has been building an image of a witty and self-confident person. Someone still saw fit to award him two awards, namely the Russian Television Academy Award for Professional Achievement. Now you know a little more about my country and its main propagandist today. Thank you for watching this video until the end.